everyone agrees to thank the organizers of this conference. And it's always nice to stay at the Yale Club, where some of us are put up, especially since they won't let me into the Harvard Club until I apologize. A general feeling I have, and I just want to voice it at the start because it informs how I'm going to talk about this, is that I worry that our discussions of war are a little bit too anecdotal and insufficiently informed by the understanding of the history of war and the structure of war. One of the things I do in my own work is try to bring in more historical perspective and structural perspective. And I do that for a number of reasons, but one of them is that I think as long as we talk about war abstractly, then the whole issue becomes, are you in favor of it, are you against it? Whereas I think if we talk about specific types of war, then we can ask the question, well, maybe what we should do is do our best to stay away from certain types of war and not other types of war, okay? So what I'm going to do today is talk about total war, which I think is the dominant form of modern war. And the question I'm going to raise is related to Seth's work about whether his account fully captures the nature of total war. But I should say that my characterization of total war will be very general. And I also should say that there's a real question about whether we are still in an age of total war or whether we've morphed into something else. So those are all questions that we could talk about. But since Seth poses the question of total war in his book, I'm going to use that as a starting point for what I'm going to say. I assume that people have read Seth's excellent work. And so let me just remind you that his concern is what he calls the moral distinction. That is, that killing civilians is worse than killing soldiers. He feels that this is intimately related to the traditional prohibition on killing civilians or non-combatants versus killing soldiers or combatants. He seems to think that they stand or fall together. And his interest is in shoring that distinction up against the threats, against the challenges to it today. Now let me begin with a somewhat historical remark. I think that Seth overstates how strongly the principle of moral distinction has been held. And the way I would put it is this: I think that every tradition has felt that it's worse to kill civilians than soldiers, but they have limited that principle to some people and not others. So if you look at every tradition, what it basically says is, for Christians, it's worse to kill Christian soldiers than Christian civilians, but it's not worse for infidels, okay? For civilized people, it's worse to kill civilized civilians than soldiers, but not for savages. And in the text in the draft of this, which I'll be happy to provide to people, I cite the British Army Manual of 1914. Let me just read this to you, because here's what the official manual said. It said, it must be emphasized that the rules of international law apply only to warfare between civilized nations. Where both parties understand or are prepared to carry them out, they do not apply to wars with uncivilized states and tribes. So, first of all, it seems to me that the moral distinction is one that throughout history has mainly been applied in some types of wars and not others. The interesting question then becomes, why is it in the 20th century that we have come to universalize this principle? What happened in the 20th century that led people to think this needs to be a principle that applies to everybody? And the answer I want to suggest is total war. We experienced a new form of war. Well, it began in the 19th century, but increased in the 20th century. Total war. I think it was the disastrous experience with total war that has led people to think that the distinction is one that has to be much more universally held and much more firmly held. And I see that as part of the project that Seth and others are involved with about how do we make sense of this principle. But what I want to say is that the challenges of total war to that principle are more substantial than Seth acknowledges. That's not to say they can't be met, it's simply to say I think they're more substantial. Okay. So what is total war? Total war is the mobilization of an entire population for the purposes of war. That's what total war is. The term comes into existence during the Napoleonic Wars. It then comes into wide use during World War I. Total war is the mobilization of a whole people to engage in the act of killing. Now, why does this create problems for the combatant, non-combatant distinction? Here's why. In the 18th century, war was limited. War between Europeans, at least, was limited. That is, in the 18th century, it's remarkable how little the average non-combatant or civilian could be aware of even what wars were being fought. An example I give in my paper is that Lawrence Stern, this great author of the 18th century, wrote a book called Sentimental Journey. He travels throughout Europe in that whole book without even knowing that England and France are at war with each other. He doesn't even know that. So you could go about your entire business and have no relationship at all to the wars that your states fought. Why then did they honor, as they did, the combatant-non-combatant distinction? Because attacking non-combatants was utterly pointless. The analogy I would give is it would make as much sense to attack English citizens for what their state was doing as it would make to attack Spanish citizens for what the English state was doing. There was no connection between the two. I'd also say I think that war was really a qualitatively different phenomenon in the 18th century. It's one of the reasons I worry about generalizations. An example would be that I would argue in the 18th century, victory was not that important to people in fighting wars. Wars was basically a negotiating ploy. It was the way corporations sue each other. They don't sue each other so that the sole point is to get victory. They sue each other to negotiate. That was what war was like. So even the term victory does not appear a lot in the 18th century. That becomes something that's more important in the age of total war. Why then does the age of total war problematize this? If every citizen is now part of mobilization, then the previous basis of the combatant-non-combatant distinction is undermined. Now every citizen becomes basically fair game. And the problem with total war in terms of making every citizen non-combatant, whatever you want to term, fair game, it's not just that it makes killing civilians more likely. New technologies can make killing civilians more likely. The problem is that it seems to make killing civilians legitimate. It seems to basically say they are fair game. The previous grounds for excluding civilians are fair game, okay? Now, the institutions of total war are the institutions of modernity. So that this is something that comes into existence with the French Revolution. Once the French Revolution occurs, every other state starts to realize that if they do not fight war the same way, they will lose. So there was an inexorable logic to it. It's not like a state could defect from this. Once they saw the power of mobilizing the whole population, they realized that if you don't do this, you will lose. So what you see then, starting with the French Revolution, is increasingly each state mobilizing its whole population achieves its kind of highest expressions in World War I and World War II. The key institution of total war is conscription. That is the key institution of conscription. And conscription is the most punitive political institution of the modern state. So worse things can happen to you if you violate criminal law, but the most punitive institution of the modern state is conscription because it's the only, unlike income taxes, it's the only institution that in every country, including the United States, you could get the death sentence for ignoring. Okay, in every country you could get the death sentence for resisting conscription. Okay, so I think that total war is something that conscription is part of it. I won't go into that, but that's one of the reasons why I have problems talking about the responsibility of soldiers. I've always had problems with this. People have heard me talk about this because I don't know how responsible you are for a choice that the alternative is the death sentence. Okay, and that's been the case up until really quite recently in most countries. So how do we maintain, given that now all citizens are engaged in war, how do we maintain the notion that nevertheless civilians are exempt from being attacked in a way that, that soldiers are not? Now, one of the issues here, and maybe we could talk about it, and maybe Seth will say more about it, is what we mean by being attacked. Because I worry that sometimes our picture is simply shooting a civilian as the model of attacking them, or the paradigmatic case, bombing them, versus other forms of aggression against them. Attacks on civilians, in my opinion, began during the Napoleonic Wars with the British policy of blockading food supplies. The first people, in my view, to attack civilians in a large way were the British in the Napoleonic Wars through creating a blockade of food supplies of the French. Britain's a maritime power. This has always been their preferred mode of fighting. This is how they fought in World War I. They blockaded the Central Powers. This is how they tried to fight World War II, blockading it, okay? And if you look at the death figures due to starvation of blockades, they are greater than any bombing of cities during World War II, okay? So we may get into what it constitutes a threat or an indirect threat, and there's lots of good issues here, okay? But in my view, from the start, total war has not just meant the engagement of citizens, but it's also meant impacting citizens in terms of life and death matters, okay? Now, how do we then shore up the combatant, non-combatant distinction? Seth has a great discussion at the beginning, I think, that lays out how Walzer tries to do this, and I think, I think most of us are familiar with the questions about Walzer's view of trying to distinguish between how much of a threat someone is. I would put it a little bit differently, but I totally agree with Seth about the problem here. As I understand it, Walzer says soldiers are fair game and civilians are not because soldiers constitute a threat and civilians do not. So therefore, soldiers in some sense forfeit or limit their right to life. Civilians do not because civilians are not doing anything to constitute a threat. That's how I understand the basic strategy of Walzer. I have always thought that Walzer's argument confuses a threat in battle with a threat in war. I think it's true that soldiers constitute a threat in battle to other soldiers as civilians do not. But in total war, the question is, do civilians constitute a threat in war that soldiers do not? And it seems to me that mobilizations of the entire populations basically mean every citizen, every non-combatant becomes in some sense part of the threat to the other nation. Another way I would put it, and this is an issue I have, is that it's conflating war with battle. It's saying that certain things are true of battle and therefore they're true of war. This is a mistake that Clausewitz talks about in the first chapter of his book, Don't Make It, and I think that oftentimes you see this mistake being made. Now, Seth obviously gives a number of ways of shoring up the distinction. The one I want to talk about is the issue of opportunistic versus eliminative killing, okay? And I should say people here are probably more familiar with this distinction, or certainly work more with it than me, but here's how I understand the distinction. The distinction seems to me this. The paradigm case of opportunistic killing is bombing the civilians of Dresden. That seems to be the case that we're given. The opportunistic killing, I think the language that Seth uses or quotes is, opportunistic killing in this case is oriented to breaking the will of the population. That's what opportunistic killing is doing in bombing, breaking the will of the population. Eliminative killing seems to be that kind of killing which simply blocks a threat or eliminates a threat. And the way that this is cashed out is that eliminative killing, in some sense, is dealing with a problem that wouldn't even be there if the person wasn't there. Okay? Whereas opportunistic killing, in some sense, takes advantage of that person's presence. The way I would put it is they don't just use the person; they use their death. They take advantage of their death. Okay. So Seth's argument, simply put as I understand it, is two types of harm: opportunistic killing, eliminative killing. Opportunistic killing is worse than eliminative killing, second point. And third, the killing of soldiers the killing of civilians is more often opportunistic killing, and the killing of soldiers is more often eliminative killing. Okay, so it seems to me there's three parts of the argument. Distinction in types of killing, one type of killing is worse than the other, and then an empirical claim that generally killing of civilians is opportunistic in a way that killing of soldiers is not. Killing of soldiers is eliminative. Okay, now there's obviously variations and qualifications of that. Okay. Now, what I want to suggest is that in total war, there is no distinction of that sort between killing civilians and killing soldiers. And I'm going to rely on Clausewitz here. What Clausewitz says is, once a whole population is engaged in war, victory means breaking the will of the population. That's what victory means. And that's why Clausewitz says, in total war, war is political in a way it was not before. The goal in total war is to break the will of the population, not just or even defeating the enemy army, okay? But my claim then is that if Clausewitz is right about that the goal is breaking the will of the population, then killing soldiers has that aim just as killing civilians does. All killing in total war aims at breaking the will of the population. All of killing in total war is equally opportunistic in that way, so that I think that the simple kind of argument that I just laid out, it simply, in this case, I would simply question whether it accurately characterizes the nature of total war. Could accurately characterize other types of war, does not accurately characterize modern war. Okay. Now, Clausewitz makes another point, and I want to just raise this at the end. He says the key to victory is not just breaking the enemy nation's will, it's sustaining the will of your own nation. There's two ways you can lose war. You can break the enemy nation's will, or you can lose the support of your own population. Either one will bring defeat in total war. So that your goal in fighting war must be two things: breaking the will of the enemy population and maintaining the will of your own population. And at the end, I would just want to raise a question about the ethics of the last point, because I want to raise whether that's not opportunistic harming towards your own soldiers. Okay. But let me talk a little bit about my characterization of total war. We have people here who know a lot about this. But what in the draft of the version, I quote Sir Basil Littlehart, who is, a great English soldier who.
Less good lover.
This was from a book. It was originally called The Real War. Then it was called The Great War, and then it was called World War I. And those of you who are familiar with history know why it went through those different titles. Okay. Here's what Littlehart writes: the immemorial lesson of history is that the true aim in war is the mind of the enemy government, and not the bodies of troops. That the balance between victory and defeat turns on mental impressions and only indirectly on physical blows. So that the key issue in total political war is basically morale, but morale of the entire country, and that's what you're attacking when you attack enemy soldiers. Now, let me draw a contrast here that I develop elsewhere in terms of the violence we see in war and the violence we see in other social practices. Clausewitz was interested in what is the nature of, what distinguishes violence in war from other types of social violence? Because he was interested, the essence of war. What's the nature of the violence that occurs in war? And what he says is, the violence that occurs in war aims at breaking the morale of the enemy group, the enemy population. He contrasts that with the violence of police officers. Because he says when police officers go after criminals, they're not trying to break the will of the community from which criminals come. That's not their purpose. Their purpose is to negate the very threat those criminals pose. Their purpose, in some sense, is eliminative killing. Just eliminate that threat. But he says in policing, your goal is not to demoralize the whole group that the criminals come from. Now, I should say, some people think that is what happens in policing. And in fact, I tend to think, we've had this discussion about Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. I mean, the way I might interpret some of the recent discussion about the role of police officers is that they are about breaking the will of the black community. But notice that if that were the case, that's what's wrong with what they're doing. That makes it political. That turns it into a kind of an opportunism that we don't think crime and punishment should be. But so what Clausewitz says is that violence against criminals, domestic violence, is really just about negating the threat that those particular criminals pose. Violence in war is about breaking the will of the people that supply the soldiers and breaking the will of the people that supply the money to pay for soldiers, all right? Now, I would suggest, how am I doing on time here? Oh, I'm doing good. I don't think you can understand modern war if you don't understand the distinction here. And let me give a couple of examples. Many actions in the world wars involve massive amounts of casualties of soldiers that where they were, they posed no threat to each other. And the paradigm case of this is the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun was entirely a battle, lasted 6 months, was entirely a battle where the German army said, we're going to draw the French army into a battle solely to demoralize the population. They chose Verdun not because it had any strategic value at all, but because they thought it symbolized something to the French people. So they said, we will engage in a 6-month battle and draw soldiers in, not because they pose a threat to us there, but solely to demoralize the population. And so my own view is that, in some sense, Verdun is a good example, I'll give you a lot more, of where the battle only occurs because of what's trying to be achieved beyond the battle, all right? And in that sense, the killing of those soldiers is solely to break the will of the people back home, in the same way that bombing them is solely to break the will of the people back home. I don't see what the difference is. Now, I should say, qualify, I think I can suggest what some differences might be, but that's why we have a discussion, okay? But my suggestion is I don't see how, on its face, those are two different enterprises. The second example of the distinction between military victory and political victory is the Vietnam War. As people undoubtedly know, the United States won every battle of the Vietnam War. People may also know that the Tet Offensive, which was the most significant battle, the Tet Offensive was a military catastrophe for the Vietnamese. It was an unprecedented military catastrophe for the Vietnamese. The Tet Offensive won the Vietnam War for the Vietnamese because the Tet Offensive was what broke the will of the American people to continue that conflict. So the theory of, and if people study this, you may know, the theory of People's War grows out of the theory of total war, because what People's War basically says is, well, then in some sense, we should ignore the importance of battles altogether and focus entirely on breaking the will of the enemy. Actually, we will avoid battles if possible. We don't care how many of our own soldiers are sacrificed. We will be willing, the United States lost 58,000 soldiers in Vietnam. The Vietnamese lost something like 1.5 million. But the Vietnamese leaders basically decided our goal is political victory, not military victory, so that's not a factor for us, okay? The final example I would give is Afghanistan this morning. People may be aware that Kunduz fell yesterday. Kunduz fell to 500 Taliban soldiers. There were over 7,000 soldiers of the Afghanistan army supposedly defending this, okay? What lesson do we take from this? Well, first of all, we take a lesson about morale, but the second thing I think we take away is that war is not, here's how Clausewitz was put it, war is not about military victory, it's about political victory. And military victory is important insofar as it involves political victory, okay? So, in any event, I could say more about that, but the main point is, if you think of war that way, it seems to me that killing soldiers has the same goal as killing civilians. That is, it has the goal of demoralizing the population. I've never quite understood, and there's something that Seth quotes several times. Downs, is that the author? About 2 types of strategies. Yeah. He talks about punitive strategies and denial strategies. And he says punitive strategies are where you attack civilians to demoralize the population. Denial strategies is where you attack the soldiers to block their threat. And I make the remark again in the draft of, if you think those are the only 2 alternatives, it's no wonder the United States has done so badly in its wars, okay? Because the reality is that all attack is designed, or non-attack is designed to break the other country's will. All of it has the same aim, killing soldiers just as opportunistic as killing civilians. Now, responses to this, well, let me, I'll just wait and hear what Seth says. I think you can respond to this, but by falling back on some of the other things that Seth not only discusses, but to some extent dismisses. You could talk about the immediacy of threats. You could talk about responsibility of threats. You could talk about the necessity of doing it, those things. So I think that the problem I'm raising could be addressed by some of the other ways that Seth tries to bolster this strategy. I doubt it, but I think it could. So it seems to me that's the logical next place to go. Let me raise one final problem at the start that's posed by the way that Clausewitz thinks about war. Sometimes militaries fight battles solely to boost morale back home. I've always wondered about the ethics of this. I've always wondered not just about killing soldiers to break their morale, but sacrificing your own soldiers to maintain your country's morale. I should say, I would like to know if anyone has ever talked about this problem, because I haven't seen it in the literature. Example, there was serious debate in World War II about the military actions in North Africa. Now, the British were in favor of military actions in North Africa for two reasons. They didn't want to get involved in the European war again, so they wanted to put that off. And the other thing is that British foreign policy has always been obsessed with maintaining access to India, so that maintaining control of the Suez Canal in India has always been a primary goal of British foreign policy. The Americans actually, A, wanted to get involved in Europe right away. Marshall wanted to invade Europe right away. And B, they could have cared less about British access to India, all right? So there was a debate about it. But what it was decided was to maintain morale. If we're not going to invade Europe right away, to maintain morale, we have to invade North Africa, even though the Americans thought it was worthless. It was a worthless endeavor. But they sort of thought it's worth the sacrifice solely because we have to give the people back home something good to feel good about, okay? And those of you, and most of us have studied war enough to know we could start iterating examples of this constantly, of military decisions that are made solely to maintain your own country's morale. The question I want to raise at the start is that using our own soldiers for purposes which soldiers should not be used for? Because it strikes me there too. If you think of war as breaking the foe's morale, maintaining your own morale, I think you have a serious problem about how your own soldiers can be used as well as other soldiers. Okay, here we go.
Seth a chance to respond for a bit.
Sure, thank you. Okay, so just firstly, it's just like to say thank you all for coming, and this is a lovely occasion for Helen and I. And Cheyney, thanks very much for your comments. I'll be fairly quick, I think. And as you know, on your main point, that's one that I anticipate in the discussion and in the draft. You talk about what I say. And yeah, I do think that essentially a lot of the purpose of killing in war, or killing in war, is opportunistic. You are trying to send a message to the enemy leaders. So it's misleading to characterize this as a clean-cut distinction. I think that all of the considerations that I appeal to through the course of the book have a similar form to this. They're not ones that individually overlap perfectly with the combatant non-combatant distinction.
Right.
It's just that when you take all of them together, you get a robust protection for civilians. And so the thought that I develop in the book is that even if there is always this opportunistic dimension to killing soldiers, there is also sometimes an eliminative dimension. And I think that that makes a difference to the relative degrees of wrongfulness involved in the harming. And I think it's important that we not kind of let the strategic level totally trump the tactical level when thinking about the ethics of war. I mean, everything that you said was framed in terms of overall strategy rather than in terms of the individual acts of killing. But then the individual acts of killing are also important. I mean, these are people the sort of people I'm talking about. I'm talking about innocent civilians and innocent soldiers. These are people who individually have rights not to be killed. And so the question of what is involved in the morality of actually killing them rather than the morality of the overall war is one that is, I think, really important. And I think that's something that's lost in focusing only on the overarching strategic perspective. Then to the point about sort of historically how pervasive this idea has been, I think it's a really good point, and it's one that I should have said. I think that people used to be super racist, and so that was the reason why they didn't think that these basic ethical principles extended to everybody. And I would suggest that the real change in the 20th century is that idea of kind of basic inequality of persons has become less and less tenable. So what happens is you get extended to everybody, the norms that you previously extended only to those people who you thought had moral status, which was only people of your religious or ethnic group or whatever. So I think that's the broader underlying explanation for that. And on total war as a practice, I mean, I think that there's a sense in which some of your discussion is in the kind of fighting the last war category. It really is sort of focused around this period of the 20th century from the First World War to Vietnam. And I think that current military practice, at least as far as advanced liberal democracies are going, is very different from that. I mean, this is obviously something that you've argued for very much in your own work,
Right.
about the alienation of modern warfare,
Right.
and how it's basically being outsourced to smaller groups. And it's not something that's being done by whole communities to the same degree. And that's obviously not to say that these kinds of societal battles won't reoccur, and in all likelihood they probably will. But it is to say that there is a bigger picture to the way wars are currently conducted, and I think it is one as well that encourages us to think more at the tactical rather than the strategic level. I mean, if you think of the war in Afghanistan, you kind of think, who is it whose will is trying to be broken by the Americans in that context? It's too amorphous and non-hierarchical for that kind of overarching strategic model to have direct application. For the Afghans fighting against the Americans, I agree that there's clearly an issue of they want to try and get to break the Americans' political will in that context. That's
Right.
clearly relevant. So I'm not sort of dismissing the significance of those kind of overarching strategic strategies as strategic considerations. I'm just saying that they're not the whole picture, and that focusing on the tactical level is also important. I think this is something that's going to come up a little bit throughout some of the discussion, and there's maybe a respect in which the book is too narrow, in as much as I have focused pretty much entirely on that on the ethics of killing, and I haven't talked a great deal about overarching strategy. The necessity chapter was kind of meant to do a bit of that, but there's definitely more that could be said. But with that, I think I'll just say thank you. And
Can I? Are you in charge here?
yeah,
I'm in charge, yes, sir.
Sir, yes, sir. Well, let me ask you a question, Seth, because in the draft of it, you're right. But I think what I say is that I'm simply not clear about what your response is. So let me ask you now. What you suggest is that there is an opportunistic killing element. There is an opportunistic element to killing soldiers. And it seems to me that you say that it is substantial enough as to kind of raise questions about whether the combatant and non-combatant distinction maps onto the opportunistic versus the limited one. The two examples you give of opportunistic killing are that when we kill soldiers in battle, we are sending a message to the other soldiers about what is going on. And when we kill soldiers in battle, we are sending a deterrence message to future wars that we will respond in these ways, okay? Now, I would say, first of all, neither of those captures the point I want to make, which is that all killing of soldiers is in some sense aimed at breaking the will of the people back home. Now as I read it, you seem to say two things there. You seem to say that nevertheless, the opportunistic killing of soldiers is itself not as bad as the opportunistic killing of civilians. That's where I would say, why? If it's oriented to the same goal, why isn't it intrinsically as bad? You also say that the killing of soldiers has an eliminative dimension that the killing of civilians does not, and so even though both are opportunistic, the killing of soldiers has an eliminative dimension. I should say, I mean, I think that's true in some sense, but I would go back to the issue, if it's eliminating the threat, what do we mean by threat? Killing civilians can be just as eliminative depending on what the threat is we have in mind as killing soldiers. So I think my comment there, and I honestly, I think I'm just not clear on, first of all, there's two separate points there, which one you want to press.
So I mean, I think I do say that you're sending a message to their leaders. I'm not sure whether I talk in terms of the overall polity, but it's clearly not just a case of sending a message to deter their fellows kind of on the battlefield. You're also trying to achieve strategic victory, and to do that, you're trying to coerce the enemy leadership. So that's definitely part of it. Look, I think that this relates to an overarching picture of the justification of killing, according to which there are all of these dimensions in which, along which one kind of killing can be worse than another. They obviously can interact sometimes in ways that one defeats the other, or one makes it the case that others aren't present. But otherwise, I see them as being broadly like weights on a scale. And I think that the fact that it's unjust obviously makes it, if you're aiming at an unjust goal, it makes it unjust. But there are these weights on a scale that go from these different ways, the different ways in which you're killing people. And I think that killing people in order to terrorize, killing unarmed people in order to terrorize their co-citizens. Look, as to whether that's a worse kind of opportunistic killing, I'm not sure how much I lean on that in the book if I say it. I can see why you would think that it's just as wrongful a kind of opportunistic killing. But I think the fact that there is this additional dimension to the killing of soldiers, that it also is often eliminative. With respect to the particular threats that they pose, that is another, that's a weight on the other side of the scale. That makes it somewhat easier to justify than harming of civilians solely opportunistically. And obviously that you can describe you could sort of just describe the overarching strategic threat and say that insofar as you're harming someone as a way of averting that threat, then it's all eliminative. But again, I think the tactical level matters. I think that if someone is themselves posing a threat, so in a way, I mean, I think I say this at the end of the chapter and at the end of the book, this is like a way of kind of reclaiming Waltz's basic idea in such a way that it kind of makes more sense, ethically speaking. You know, it doesn't work to say that you lose your right to life just in virtue of being a threat. But it does make sense to say that there's an limited dimension to harming you that would be absent if you weren't posing a threat. And that isn't going to give us the whole of the protection of civilians in war at all, but that's why it's an appeal to multiple foundations. And that's what you were saying at the end. That's the overall.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, I mean, first of all, I completely agree that I talk about total war because I think that's where the problem first arises in modernity, is with that. What we have now, there's an excellent book, John Mueller is someone who writes about this, people know his work, and he actually suggests that the things we call wars now are actually misnamed by that because they're really just large-scale crimes, and in some sense they're better understood not with traditional laws of war at all, and I think that's something that people like Mary Calder have argued. But I would still, I mean, you put it in terms of strategic and tactical. I think I have the worry in terms of talking about battles versus talking about wars. I think too much discussion is kind of a certain picture of what happens in a battle, and that's what a war is. I mean, the odd thing about people's war is that you win by not engaging the enemy. You win by just waiting them out, and this is what drove the United States nuts in Vietnam, was because all their military actions were designed to get the Vietnamese soldiers to come out and fight. So in an odd way, you're breaking the will of the enemy by not killing them, by avoiding killing them, okay? So that's why I sort of think there is that distinction is very, very important, because it, as Clausewitz says, it creates a space between the military and the political that is somewhat distinct to modern war.
Okay, let me open it up. So, Victor?
So thanks very much. Great book, nice talk. Enough of the compliments. Enough of the negative stuff.
Right.
I think you say some of the right stuff in the chapter on this, that there's a relationship between the eliminative and opportunistic, but I thought you could just say a lot more there. So think about this simple case. I'm attacked by X and Y and Z. I could eliminate the threats of X, Y, and Z by shooting them all, but if I shoot X, that will cause Y and Z to run away. No problem there with opportunistic killing, because I already had the eliminative justification. I could have done the whole lot, and so the fact that this will also have this opportunistic effect, no problem. And that's true even if I pick the method of killing X which will lead Y and Z to run away, so I don't have to bother killing Y and Z, rather than picking a method which wouldn't have that effect. In those cases, it looks like a kind of CAM thing, where it's like principle of secondary permissibility. In fact, I wouldn't be permitted to do it one way, means that I can also use. I'm not inflicting any extra harm on the person over. And so that's going to apply sometimes to combatants. Now imagine the case where I wouldn't be able to kill X and Y and Z, because I wouldn't be able to eliminate the threats. So if I kill X, Y and Z will still kill me, were it not for the fact that killing X would make Y and Z run away. More difficult case may well still be permissible, though, to do that. But we're thinking about more challenging case, I think, than the first case, where I wouldn't be able to complete the whole action eliminatively. That looks like it might be tougher. Now think about the case where I could capture or kill. And if I kill, it will have the opportunistic effect. If I capture, the soldier will be saved. So we could surround these soldiers and capture them all. But if we kill them and blow their heads off, that will be advantageous in opportunistic terms because it will demoralize the enemy to see their fellow combatants having their heads blown off. Then you might think, well, that's impermissible now. I had this alternative way of eliminating the threat where I could have captured them at very little harm to themselves, and I'm harming them now simply for the opportunistic reasons. And it's pretty plausible that it's wrong to kill but not capture. So then once you explore a little bit more the relationship between the eliminative and opportunistic decisions, we're going to find some cases where opportunistically killing combatants is wrong, like the case I just described, some cases where it's clearly permissible. And I think that's going to help to deal with the challenges Cheyney has, while still allowing the opportunistic harming principle has implications for what we do to combatants.
Can I just comment on that? This is a comment and not so much a response. The Germans killed more Allies than the Allied killed Germans in World War II. The big difference was that the Allies captured more Germans than the Germans captured Allies. And there's reason to think that in terms of morale back home, people are more distressed if a family member has been captured than if a family member has been killed. So interestingly, if the goal is victory, there's reason to think that you're better off capturing the enemy than you are killing them. That's one of the reasons why, again, the notion that it's always killing the person that leads to victory strikes me as questionable. And that's just a comment on it, because I tend to think that just as there's too much equation of killing the enemy is blocking the threat and victory, I tend to think there's too much equation on killing versus doing other things to the enemy.
Right,
You ended up killing the enemy. That was because it's easier to do than capture them.
And there's two ways of justifying opportunistically harming someone. You should pick the one which is less harmful. And if capturing is better opportunistically than killing and does less harm to combatants, do that.
Absolutely. It's just more expensive is the problem.
Right.
You have all these soldiers, you have millions of soldiers you have to take care of. It's just easier for countries to just kill them.
So I think those are all good points, and I don't go into it in a huge amount of detail. One important thing, though, is that you're talking about permissibility. And so I'm also talking about situations where what you're doing is impermissible and when it's worse. And I'm more inclined to think that an additional opportunistic element is always an extra weight on the scales of making something more wrongful when you're otherwise acting impermissibly. So that's something that isn't brought out by the case you're talking about. But I think the kind of permissible cases where what you're doing would otherwise be permissible on the basis only of an eliminative justification, the fact that it has this additional effect doesn't render it harder to justify or impermissible. That's one of the sort of circumstances which I was mentioning when I described it, where you have this kind of contextual interaction such that the presence of something else makes it the case that this is no longer a weight on the scales that would add on. So I'm going to think about it more. I don't have a fully worked out view. I think that what I said in the book was enough to kind of motivate the basic idea, but I should probably do more to develop it in detail.
So we have a follow-up.
Actually, not anymore, because I think Seth clarified what I was going to say.
Okay.
So do you want to do
Okay, then Helen.
So this is really just to try and clarify how you're thinking of this idea of a killing being kind of in part opportunistic and in part eliminative. Because that makes it sound like, look, we've got a killing, because I agree with you, right? I mean, that opportunistic killing is worse than eliminative, but that makes it sound like, look, we've got a killing, let's say 70% of it's opportunistic and 30% eliminative, and then we have another killing that's just 100% opportunistic, so that's worse. So that's a weird view, right? It's rather we've got a killing and it's opportunistic, and then we've got another killing and that's opportunistic, but the first killing also has some eliminative benefits. It's hard to see how on that picture, sort of having this extra feature of the killing, given that it's already an opportunistic killing, somehow makes it better. So how are you thinking of this sort of, how is that extra dimension supposed to somehow make it a less worse killing, given that we granted that it's opportunistic? They're both opportunistic killings.
So really it does come down to this idea that these are like weights on a scale. And I'm not sure what the best way is to characterize the wrongfulness of the of opportunistic agency. It certainly seems like in part it has to do with the reasons on which you're acting and the character of the will that you show towards the person. And I think that insofar as that's true, it's going to be the case that if you have mixed reasons, then the character of your will towards the person is different from if you have unmixed reasons. So I don't see any problem with seeing. I don't think it would be a
What's
percentage.
objectionable is how I'm willing to treat somebody. It's true that I'm willing to treat them opportunistically in both cases. So it's not clear how it's somehow better because I also get the fact that it's limited. I mean, if we're objecting to the sort of how I'm willing to treat people, it's the same in both cases. I'm willing to make use of them in both cases.
Yeah, I think that the basic idea is that so when you harm someone eliminatively, part of the benefit that you're getting you would have had in the absence of their being there. Okay, so that's one respect in which it's less wrongful to harm them that way. And when you harm them opportunistically, the benefit you're getting is something that you wouldn't have had in their absence. So I think that the fact that part of what you're doing is eliminative, or what you're doing is partly eliminative, just carries over the benefits of limited agency versus opportunistic agency. I don't really see why they wouldn't be, why these considerations wouldn't be salient in a mixed killing. I mean, why would it be the case that opportunistic agency, the fact that there's opportunistic agency present, would just dominate the other aspect of it? I mean, if you think of someone who's killing unjustly, if they're killing somebody who constitutes a threat to them, and they're gaining an additional benefit from them, it seems pretty clear to me that that's less egregiously wrongful than when they're killing someone who doesn't constitute a threat to them, just because it has this additional eliminative dimension. So I guess I don't feel the force of the worry.
I could see that might be true in cases where the killing is permissible, but where the killing is wrong, it seems weird to think that the fact you get this extra, that it's also eliminative somehow makes it better. So I could grant that in the case that were permissible killings, but in unjust killings it seems. Like that's where I'm finding it.
I guess this goes back to, so the so if two killings are equally opportunistic, in my claim, killing civilians and killing soldiers are both aimed at breaking the will. The fact that the killing the soldier has a limited dimension, in some sense, mitigates the problem of the opportunistic dimension. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, it makes it a less seriously wrongful kind of killing than the other one. For the same reason that eliminative agency is generally easier to justify than opportunistic agency.
Well, okay.
Insofar as it is, right?
Yeah, no.
I guess my thought is, but you've still got to meet that threshold of justifying the opportunistic agency because we've agreed it's an opportunistic killing already. So it's not like you have to say, look, it's easier to justify because it's only in part opportunistic. It's either opportunistic or it's not, right? So you've still got to meet the threshold.
But it's not justified in this circumstance. So we're talking about unjust killing.
Right, but
So the
okay,
point is just that it's so easy to justify. It's just a way of describing the question of pro tanto wrongfulness. The claim is just this: more seriously pro tanto wrongful. I think there clearly are degrees of wrongful killing, and the kind that I described at the outset, the heading of Daniel Pearl, is clearly at an extreme of it. I don't see why there's anything sort of suspect about supposing that the extreme kind of the gradient starts at killing someone who poses an immediate threat to you, and you shouldn't be there in the first place. It's unjust for you to kill him, but otherwise he's going to kill you. You're only gaining the benefit you're gaining isn't something that depends on its presence, and then just kind of continuous through the grades towards the worst kind of killing.
Yeah, I think we're going to move on, and I'm sure we'll return to this theme many times. So Jeff is the.
Well, I can ask my question later. There seems to be two targets of opportunistic communication that Cheyney mentioned. One is the people, population. The other is the government. That's why I like the quotation from Basil Littlehart.
Right.
Is that he says the ultimate aim is the minds of the government leaders. And one of the ways in which the killing of soldiers can be opportunistic, if the real target is the minds of the government leaders, is through convincing the government leaders that they can no longer persist militarily in the conflict, and if they continue, they're going to lose. So in a way, the agency in killing the soldiers is opportunistic in, I think, a benign way, in that what it's doing is persuading the leaders that they can't continue to fight. So it's fundamentally eliminative, in that what you're doing is you're eliminating their capacity to continue to fight militarily. And it's only in this secondary, supervenient way that it's opportunistic. And I think that's benign. It's like taking an aggressor's weapons away, and then he's not going to continue to try to attack you because he realizes he can't succeed. And so it's fundamentally eliminative in that way, and only secondarily opportunistic. And there's also this that I think that's really the aim. And you know the history a lot better than I do, Cheyney, but I wonder if you and Clausewitz are right that there's always the aim of affecting the will of the people back home. One thing that struck me about that idea is that surely that depends a lot on what kind of influence the people back home have over their government.
Right.
And in the case, I noticed that, for example, you never mentioned the Soviet Union under Stalin or Iraq under Saddam Hussein. They operate independently to a considerable extent of the will of the people back home. It doesn't matter what the people think because they're all terrorized and in submission anyway. And at least in those cases, the aim is to affect the mind of the government leaders, and you can do that in this fundamentally limited way. I should say, I agree with what Victor wanted to say, though, and that is if you have these clear cases where the killing of soldiers who are not liable to be killed for whatever reason or functioning opportunistically, then that does actually seem more objectionable than killing soldiers
You're absolutely right, Jeff. I mean, in my view, that's basically then say we need to just move on to a more specific, thicker description of what we're talking about. I would say, though, I think what Clausewitz would say is that the notion that you're killing soldiers just to impact the government is actually what was going on in limited war. Because in limited war, all that you were doing was you were killing soldiers to influence Frederick the Great's decisions about where to go next, okay? That's just the difference between wars of popular mobilization, 19th century and 20th century wars, and wars of, and more limited wars. Again, more anecdotal evidence from me. The German government was aware by 1942 they couldn't win the war. As soon as their invasion of the Soviet Union basically stopped, it was clear that there was no way they could win that war. They could only not lose it, okay, but they couldn't win it. So it was clear to the government. I mean, we have records that Hitler was aware that he wasn't going to win the war by 1942, but Hitler was crazy. So there was no way to impact his decisions. In some sense, the argument for, therefore, in some sense, there's an argument for, then the only way to impact the decision is to start bombing the civilians and stuff like that and hope that that would have an impact. So I do think you're right that the relationship of the government to the people is problematic. That certainly in the case of Saddam Hussein, breaking the will of the people is a different issue. But I don't think the problem I'm raising, and I don't know if you're suggesting this, I don't think it can be addressed solely by simply saying all we're doing is trying to impact the will of the government. That doesn't seem to me a characterization of what's happened in most total war. So there we have an empirical issue.
So first, I think we should. I'm always a little cautious about using the opportunistic limited distinction in the context of war for the following reason. Usually, when we think of limited killing, we're thinking of an individual whose presence or activity threatens to make you worse off, and then you eliminate that potential threat to you. But in the war context, that's not really true. No individual civilian makes anyone worse off. So I'm always a little cautious about, and with soldiers it's a little bit more complicated because it depends on whether you think about the specific micro threat that this individual poses, and if they weren't there, maybe someone else would pose a different micro threat to you. But I do worry that sometimes we kind of take a concept or distinction between opportunistic and eliminative killing that was developed at the individual level, and we kind of project it onto a collective level. I just think we should be bit careful about that. Just that, I wanted to pose this to you. So, to Seth. So usually we think eliminative killing is less bad because in some way it prevents an unjust threat from materializing. So the case that's often used against Walzer, and Jeff obviously used this to great effect. I attack Victor, right, unjustly, right? Victor now uses force in self-defense against me, totally justifiably. And Jeff, of course, says, well, I don't have a right to kill Victor just because he was a threat to me. It's true that I would be killing him eliminatively, right, in some sense. Does that make it less bad? This is another way of getting at this point. If it's an unjust killing, does it matter if it's eliminative or not? And in particular, once we take out considerations of defenselessness and vulnerability, does it still make a difference that it's an unjust eliminative killing or not?
Yeah, so I mean, I have gone back and forth about this, and in early versions of the chapter, I was kind of on the other side. I thought it didn't make a difference for an unjust killing. Now I think that it does. I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that it's not that eliminative killing is great, you know, it's that opportunistic killing is super bad, right? That's the thing that is the key thing to remember. It's that when you use someone opportunistically, you're deriving a benefit from them, and I know that Victor has a different account of opportunistic agency, but when you're using someone opportunistically, you're deriving a benefit from harming them that you wouldn't have had in their absence. Now there are obviously subtleties and curlicues around there that need to be worked out, but that's the basic underlying idea that everybody is motivated by when they think about these things. That is the thing that is especially bad. And I think that is, if you like, continuously bad, regardless of whether the killing is just or unjust. There can be circumstances in which the availability of an alternative justification for what you're doing might make it a case that these additional benefits are not determinative, and that's the sort of thing that Victor was talking about. And I'm not fully sure what I think about those. But as to whether and why I think it makes wrongful killings worse, yes, I do, and it's because the opportunistic kind of killing is so seriously wrong.
So, but I was trying to get at what Helen was getting at. If you have two killings that are opportunistic and one's eliminative, you made it sound like that brings the wrongness down. But the point of the case that I was creating with Victor is to show it's not a mitigating factor in that way. So I was trying to get that. Once you control for the opportunistic aspect of it and it's unjust, does the fact that it's eliminative make it less bad? I'm not sure. So the wrong making factor is there.
I mean,
I'm just wondering.
I think if it's yes, I think that it does. It depends on the character of the opportunistic agency. So I think if you're using somebody to a greater degree, then other things equal, it's going to be a more seriously wrongful killing. And I think that the point is that when there is the presence of this non-opportunistic element as well, that's an indication that you're using them to a somewhat lesser degree. Now, if you had a situation where you've got, okay, so in one circumstance you've got the existent, what you have with the killing of Daniel Pearl, and you find some way to jerry-rig the example so that there's an eliminative dimension to it as well. It could be that in that case, the opportunistic dimension is so egregious that the eliminative aspect of it is silenced. But the basic idea is that in war that's that there's still going to be a difference in the particular character of the killings. And if you think about the kinds of unjust killings that take place in war, and you contrast killing soldiers on the battlefield unjustly in the pursuit of an unjust cause with firebombing their cities at home, I think that this kind of is perfectly intuitive.
Just mine.
Sorry.
Yeah.
David Maple.
I'd just like to try to restate Cheyney's main criticism and see if I understand it correctly. So Seth, I think in your mention you say, well, all killing or has both opportunistic and limited elements to it. But killing civilians is likely to be more worse than killing soldiers because the element of opportunistic killing is likely to be more predominant. And I take it Cheyney is simply saying, as an empirical generalization, that's often false. If we really look at the character of these wars, a lot of them, when we're killing soldiers, were engaged in just as much kill civilians, that offensive is a good example of this. Total war is another example of this, and so on. I think empirically that's false, actually, for the kinds of reasons Jeff gave. That is often the object of war is simply to eliminate a degrade militant, and as a result, get the other side to stop. But is that basically the issue? Is just empirical disagreement about how often this mixture of eliminative and opportunistic killing is worse and more? I mean, how often?
Well, I mean, first of all, the phrase just empirical, I'd worry about. The whole problem arises because in modern war, non-combatants are engaged in the effort just as combatants are. We can have wars, that's not the case. The whole problem, it seems to me, of this distinction arises from the empirical fact that in modern war, that distinction has been blurred, okay? If we were still in the 18th century, we wouldn't be having this discussion. But my point is this, if you're bombing Dresden to demoralize the population, it seems to me you're bombing Dresden for exactly the same reason as you're killing soldiers to demoralize the population. It seems to me it's the exact same opportunistic harm. Now, there may be further factors that mitigate the opportunistic harm in the case of killing soldiers. And I understand what Seth is saying is, well, there's this further factor that killing soldiers has an eliminative dimension, whereas killing civilians does not. But setting that aside, the goal is exactly the same, which is to break the will. The claim is to break the will of the population. I don't see how one is worse, in that dimension is worse than the other. I also don't see, I mean, I have questions about, I haven't worked with as much as people here about the distinction of eliminative and opportunistic. I mean, if you're bombing a plant and trying to kill the people that work there so that they don't supply forces, it seems to me that what you're trying to achieve could be actually even better achieved if they weren't there in the first place. I mean, it seems to me that you're eliminating a threat. So it seems to me that those, in those cases, it has an eliminative dimension too. In any event, but I have to say, I do think that our arguments at some point have to talk about what is empirically the case in war. I always worry, I've voiced this at times, that particularly when we use abstract examples, we move away from talking about, well, what really is, what really are the threats here, what are the kinds of problems we get. I would say, I didn't mention this, but I mentioned it in the draft of it, I very much like the fact that Seth so much draws on empirical work about the nature of threats and stuff like that. So that's why, also why I sort of thought it was appropriate to engage him on that level. And it was a long answer, David.
Yeah, so I have similar words to those raised by Helen and by Adam. So I agree that killing opportunistically is worse than killing eliminatively, but it's not clear to me that killing both eliminatively and opportunistically is less bad than killing nearly purely opportunistically. So in reply to Helen, you said something like, I respect you more, my will is less bad if my killing is both opportunistic and eliminative. Surely that depends on the reasons that I act upon. So suppose that killing you is both opportunistic and eliminative, but I don't care about the fact that it's eliminative. I would kill you, I don't even think about that. And I think that this speaks to some of the things that Cheyney is talking about, right? So suppose that the killing that is perpetrated in a certain war is in fact eliminative, but that doesn't play any role in our deliberation to which they war, because we are just interested in breaking the will of the people. It seems that in that case, the will, the reasons that the respect that I show to you is no less than the respect I would show if the killing was purely opportunistic.
So let me try and sort of characterize the general worry here. The notion then is that when we're talking about justified eliminative killing, the fact that there's an additional opportunistic element doesn't make a difference if it's already sufficient, if it's justified already on the basis of it being limited. So this is the principle of secondary permissibility kind of claim. And then there's a notion that when there's unjustified opportunistic killing, it doesn't make any difference if it has an additional eliminative element. So the notion is that in these two sort of mirroring ways, there's this contextual interaction between the different elements of a killing such that they don't function like additional weights on the scale in that kind of additive way. One of them kind of rubs out and erases the significance of the other one. I think that's the overarching picture that's coming out from the criticism. I have a general worry about this, which is that, like Cheyney says, all of the killing in war it does have this very mixed character, and I don't see it being. It seems implausible to me that when you have all of these killings that are mixed in all of these different ways, that you can just sort of pick out one factor and deny that the others are relevant. But that I think would be the way that one would have to go. As to the quality of Royal Point, yeah, I mean, I don't do a lot of work in the chapter to kind of motivate and characterize and defend the limited opportunistic agency distinction. The chapter actually originally started out as being skeptical about it. And so I was sort of, I don't have a great kind of theory in defense of it. I do still think that the idea that you're using somebody to a greater degree is intelligible, and that I think that you're using them to a lesser degree when there's also this eliminative element. So I think that there's, yeah, that view still seems to be plausible, but I think that the general idea here is that I need to think more about these kind of admixtures.
Yeah, this is right. My point is that what might matter is the reason that you act upon. I mean, in principle, the distinction is plausible, but whether the distinction does the work that you want to do seems to depend on the reason that you act upon.
I'm feeling the conflicted pulls of preventing suffering of people and being fair to those who sort of accepted relatively docile manner by saying that they couldn't have follow-up. So I'm going to go with fairness for now. Some of these points are going to come up as we go. But there are a couple more questions. We're going to push through till just about 11. We started about 15 minutes late. And then we'll just have a slightly shorter coffee break, if that's okay with everybody. So the next question is here.
Hi. I'll try to be brief because I'd like to relieve suffering as well. And I see Jeff right in front of me here. He's obviously in distress. I was intrigued, Seth, by your suggestion, at least, that it's the nature of modern warfare may make some of Cheyney's points less salient. And on the one hand, I could see that if we're talking about traditional nation states, you've got a pretty strong alignment between the civilian population and the state itself, and therefore the will that is your target is readily identifiable. And that's less the case in some of the modern conflicts we've been involved in, whether it's counterinsurgency or other sorts of things going on with Islamic State and so forth. But on the other hand, it seems to me that in some respects, morale and will, if you will, is even more salient in the modern setting. It's more difficult to identify sort of the population whose will that's relevant. But these are people who are sort of sitting, hedging their bets. Their allegiances are much more fluid. And so it would seem to be that in many instances it's even more significant that you focus on sort of the opportunistic dimension than say if you get at least as significant as when you had a traditional nation state as an adversary.
Can I? Well, first of all, I do think in many ways we've moved beyond total war. So the suggestion that the logic is not entirely Clausewitz's is certainly open. But whether we move beyond it entirely in this dimension strikes me as very problematic. I mean, first of all, many conflicts now are funded by diaspora communities. There's a sense in which the aim of the conflict is to demoralize that diaspora community. I don't see what difference it makes if it's a traditional nation state or a community of some other sort. But also the fact is that whether or not the people of the United States is attacking are people that are popularly supported, whatever. It's certainly the case that the actions of the United States are determined massively by the popular support for the actions. If that were not the case, the government wouldn't do so much to try and shield the average person from those costs. Borrowing instead of raising taxes, professional army instead of military. So I think that even though it's a muddier situation, it seems to me that clearly the people that are fighting the United States feel that their main goal is political victory. Their main goal is to wait out the United States, and that's not the same thing as how many soldiers they kill. So I agree that we've moved into a different type of war, but whether or not it's that different, I would raise, again, questions about that.
Cheyney, you accused Walter by confusing the goal of might help Seth avoid your difficulty. Namely, think about the soldiers. The soldiers, even in Verdun, were defending themselves. The government has its own goal, but they were defending themselves. So their killing were usually eliminating rather than opportunistic. They were attacked, and the usual soldier has a mission to accomplish. And in order to accomplish it, he has to kill some soldiers that will attack him, while usually if the soldier kills civilians, the civilians are, if their killing is opportunistic. You might be right that the goal of the war, the goal of the government, the goal is opportunistic, but the killings that the soldiers commit are eliminated. Or they are more likely to be eliminated than opportunistic if they kill soldiers, and if they kill civilians, they are more likely to be opportunistic.
Well, I'm sorry if it sounded like I was accusing Wolf. I mean, I think I was commenting that it always seemed to me that there was a problem with the way, and you know more about this, Yitzhak, than I do. I would simply respond, though, by, in turn, challenging your description of what was going on. It's true that once the French soldiers were sent to Verdun, once they were there, they were in some sense defending themselves. But there was a serious issue about should they have been sent there in the first place, and that was one of the issues which led the entire French army to mutiny at one point, which was basically to say, we're told we're defending ourselves, but actually we're just being sent to these battles that have no point at all. So it's true that an individual soldier, once they're in the battle, is kind of defending themselves. But whether the army is defending anything is a separate issue. So that's again why I don't have any dog in this
There is
fight.
moral difference here
Yeah.
between the killing of the soldiers, killing soldiers by soldiers, and killing civilians by soldiers. The individual soldier commit one type of thing in the first place, and another in the second. And Seth, I think is right to point to a moral difference between these.
Well, I don't want to deny that there's a moral difference between these cases. And I don't think I even suggested that Seth doesn't make the case for it. I simply said there's other problems that it seems to me needs to address. But let me put it bluntly. I think soldiers in war are used as civilians are used in war. That's why I'm opposed to war. There's a difference between raping a 9-year-old and raping a 20-year-old. Everyone knows the difference. You get a different sense. There's a difference between raping a 9-year-old and raping a 20-year-old. That doesn't tell us anything about our blanket condemnation of rape. Okay? So to me, there's a difference between killing soldiers and killing civilians. That's an interesting distinction. For me, it doesn't mean anything about whether I blanketly condemn war or not. And that's why I agree that there's a distinction here. I just don't think the distinction leads to the conclusions that Just War theorists think it does. That's the difference.
So I want another bite at the opportunistic eliminative relationship. So I think your intuitions are being colored either by the reasons for which the defender is acting or by thinking some of these eliminative cases are close to justified. So here's an example. You're sitting there right by a runaway trolley, right? And it's not going to take a lot of weight to stop the trolley. So you have a choice between Helen and me. You can throw either of us on the track and stop the trolley. That's not opportunistic killing, right? Next question. You say, well, how should I pick between them? Well, Helen's getting all this attention for her book. And I'd really like to eliminate her from consideration, because if I do that, it'll be better for me. Your argument is that it is better for you to throw Helen on the track than to throw me on the track, because you get no eliminative benefit, right, from killing me, whereas you do from her. That can't be right, right? So
let's say there are other reasons for pushing Helen on. No, I think that's right. I think what this sort of shows, and Yitzhak's point really helps with this, is that the way in which you get the mixture is really important. I agree with you in that sort of interpersonal case where it's just my reasons that are at stake. That goes back to Massimo's point. So I think the thing that I really need to say, or needed to have said, is that the key distinction is between who's acting opportunistically or eliminatively. And I think that what Yitzhak just said, this I think puts it really nicely, that the soldiers themselves in general, when they're fighting, under soldiers fighting, they're not trying to achieve these broad strategic goals. They're trying to stop the person from killing them. And that's the thing that makes it, that has sort of moral significance. The fact that from the strategic level, the generals are trying to break the will of the enemy, so it is kind of overarching opportunistic, is not the thing that kind of, so the mixture comes from there being two different agents who are kind of involved in the killing, and then having different sort of agential roles within the approach, rather than there being limited and opportunistic dimensions within the same agent, if you see what I mean. I think that must be the crucial point. But that's just something I'm going to say in the response to Cheyney.
One last.
Yeah, just rather as a quick comment. Some of your points, Cheyney, about the relationship between battle and war sound a lot like what 11 states have said about what they think attacks means in the context of how they interpret the Geneva Conventions and the rules they're in, because they talk about attacks as a whole, and that then that basically raises the bar in terms of the proportionality calculus. What I'd be a little bit interested in, we don't have to talk about it now, but it's kind of a threshold question. What do you think the threshold for war is, and what do you think the threshold for battle is? Because it seems without those, you don't get into the opportunistic, eliminative dimension that at least Seth is talking about in this context. You may have it in other contexts, and law enforcement is one example. But I think you need to consider that question. And talking historically, I was a little bit intrigued, and maybe you deal with it in the paper. Lieber has a lot more to say about the issue of demoralization than anyone does in contemporary rules regarding the conduct of hostilities. And I think that's an interesting question that may shed some light on some of the issues you touched on.
Can I? Let's continue that discussion. There was a larger point, I should say, that, again, I gestured towards the paper that I didn't say here. The reason for talking about battles is that we know what we're talking about. I mean, it's clear usually that the aim of a battle is to capture a certain city or something like that. And Clausewitz actually says that's why people like to talk about battles, is because it's kind of clear and we can actually make a judgment of proportionality about what is it worth to capture that city. He said the problem is that war is not like that. War is about breaking the wills of populations. War is about things that he says, because they're political, they're vague. And he's very sad about this, because he said, I wanted a science of war, but now I found out that war is about things that are both vague and indeterminate. And in some sense, we can't talk about it with that level of precision. And a question that I would raise is that what problems does this raise for just war theory? Because we talk about things like, is the cost proportionate to whatever? We think that we can, in some sense, have clear ideas about what's being weighed here, but again, the Clausewitzian point is we don't. But it's simply, we're entering into a level of contestability and vagueness, and we just have to be humble about our ability to weigh these things and stuff like that. Hey, General Madam.
Very well, join me in thanking Cheyney.